Everyone is familiar with the Space Shuttle, which was operational from 1981 to 2011. Although it was so far the only crewed spaceplane to reach operational status, it wasn't the first spaceplane to be designed. The Space Shuttle had an ancestor of sorts, which was the X-20 Dyna-Soar project of the late 1950s and early 1960s. The X-20 was an Air Force program to develop a military spaceplane. The name Dyna-Soar was short for a dynamic soarer. Research into the feasibility of spaceplanes was conducted during the early and mid-1950s. The X-20 project was started by the U.S. Air Force Air Research and Development Command in October of 1957, shortly after the launch of Sputnik by the Soviets. And those separate programs were combined into a single project, the Dyna-Soar program, and was given the designation Weapon System 464L. It was designed to be a crewed, reusable hypersonic glider and was intended to be a successor to the X-15 program. The development of such a spacecraft would have normally been overseen by NASA. However, advances made by the Soviets in space worried the Department of Defense, which saw the possibility of military operations in space. The Department of Defense saw potential uses of a spacecraft like the X-20 for reconnaissance and bombing missions. The X-20 became a U.S. Air Force program overseen by the Air Force Systems Command, although there was close collaboration with NASA engineers due to the potential of both military and civilian missions. It was much more advanced than the other crewed spacecraft of the period and was designed to glide to Earth under piloted control to land on a runway, unlike the space capsules in development at the time, which returned to Earth by ballistic re-entry and landing by parachute. It was to be a low delta wing design with winglets instead of a conventional vertical tail, and was to be built from high-temperature metal alloys to protect it from the high heating of re-entry into the atmosphere. It would have had a single cockpit with an equipment bay behind it. One variant included a 4-person module in the equipment bay. Since it was determined that rubber tires would burn during re-entry, Goodyear developed retractable wire brush skids for the landing gear, which would have been made from the same alloy as the craft itself. The contract was awarded to Boeing in June of 1959, and the overall design was finalized in March of 1960. In April of 1960, 7 astronauts were secretly selected for the program. One of those astronauts was Neil Armstrong. One proposed launch vehicle was an early variant of the Saturn rocket, the Saturn I. In 1961, the Titan III rocket was selected as the launch vehicle. The launch site would have been Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida, with the first orbital flight planned for the end of 1965. However, despite the program's ambitious goals, development progress was slowed by inconsistencies in funding and indecision over both overall mission requirements and which launch vehicle would be used prior to the selection of the Titan III. Projected dates of test flights were constantly pushed back. There were also questions about the Air Force having a crewed space program when that was the mission of NASA. It was argued by the Air Force that Dyna-Soar entailed controlled re-entry, which was the focus of the program. In January of 1963, the Department of Defense ordered the Air Force to conduct a study to determine the future of the program, looking at whether Gemini or Dyna-Soar was the more viable concept for a space-based weapon system. In March of 1963, after reviewing the study, it was determined that the focus on controlled re-entry took precedence over applications for orbital flight. The program was seen as expensive, with no crewed missions launched until the mid-1960s at the earliest. It had become increasingly difficult for the Air Force to justify the program, and it was ultimately canceled in December of 1963. The cost of the program was $660 million, equivalent to $5.6 billion in 2025. Despite the cancellation of the program, it did lead to further research into spaceplanes and hypersonic flight. Some systems developed were used in the X-15, as well as making advances in re-entry and heat protection technologies and control systems. Although it never progressed beyond the research stage and a mock-up having been built, the X-20 can be seen as sort of an ancestor to the Space Shuttle and today's uncrewed X-37 spaceplane. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. And remember, when the future was cool.